Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, as we mentioned in the chat, I'd just like to remind you that you'll all remain muted with your cameras off. And I know that using a Zoom meeting is a bit unconventional for a webinar, but we're actually trying this out so we can use the breakout room feature for future events, different networking styles. So hopefully I'll have the chance to meet some of you face-to-face in upcoming webinars. But today, you'll all be hidden and muted, so you can put on your cozy pants, grab some crunchy snacks without fear, and just don't forget to take notes on all of the awesome tips from our speakers. So we welcome you to ask questions in the chat window. You can ask them anytime, but we'll wait to go over these questions during the Q&A session near the end of our talk. And in case you can't stick around for the whole thing, don't worry. We'll send you the recording afterwards so you don't miss anything. So I'm Lauren from Arc.dev, a platform for hiring pre-vetted remote software engineers. If you have any questions about Arc, I welcome you to reach out to me after the talk or visit our website, arc.dev. But for now, I'd like to turn our attention to our special guests. So I'm incredibly excited to welcome today's speakers. We have Mariah Driver, Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Webflow. With a unique perspective from her background in psychology, she's on a mission to make Webflow a diverse and radically inclusive company. So you give a little wave so we know who's who.
Hi.
And we have Leah Knobler, Director of Talent Acquisition at Help Scout. The DEI strategy she built there has had a huge impact on the company. In just a short time, their engineering team has grown from 5% to 37% women, and they aren't stopping anytime soon. So Mariah and Leah have built their Webflow and Help Scout's highly effective DEI strategies from the ground up. So today we'll discuss how diversity, equity, and inclusion have been fundamental to their team's success, and we'll share a ton of actionable tips that you can use in your own companies. And don't worry, this won't be the same of the millions of webinars out there this year. This discussion will really give you actual action items that you can add to your to-do list today. So let's jump in. First, let's quickly go over the basics. Mariah and Leah, can you help define the main three elements of DEI? So what is diversity?
I'm gonna let you start.
All right. We talked about this earlier. We're gonna do the awkward, like, no, you go, just because we want to remind everyone that we're all human. So first, when I think about DEI, I don't think about, and obviously, we need to build DEI strategies, but DEI as a concept is not an HR strategy, and it's ultimately not a PR strategy, which I think is something that a lot of people think of it as, but really it's a strategic lens of how you view your entire organization. So the processes, the practices, the policies across every department and across every team. So it really should be a horizontal function. And then how I define diversity is a presence of difference. So an important thing is that diversity is relative. So in any given context, someone adds a different level of diversity than they do to a different context, and every single person has elements of their identity that are inherently going to add diversity to a context, whether they're a parent, whether they have a racial or ethnic background that's underrepresented in a space. So no person is inherently diverse, and no person is inherently not diverse. And that's one thing that we like to make sure we clarify when we talk about kind of pulling everyone in and calling everyone into that work as the diversity definition.
Awesome. Yeah, I think you nailed that entirely. I think I would just add, for equity, just sort of is that quality of fairness, making sure all your processes and programs are fair and provide, equal possible outcomes for everybody at your company. So is your compensation structure fair? How are promotions decided? Things like that has to do with equity for us.
Awesome, thank you. And so inclusion, there's three, little uneven here. Who wants to grab that last one? You can fight over it if you want.
We can say it at the exact same time, and we'll say it.
I can. So between the three, I think this is helpful in context. Is diversity is that presence. Then I think inclusion is the practice of engaging difference. So once you have difference, and differences between identities, differences between ages, differences between abilities, then inclusion is making sure that you are engaging and activating those different identities and activating across difference. So recognizing that with each of those identities, with each of those experiences, they have different needs for what it means to be empowered and what it means to be activated at work, and enabled to succeed and able to speak up. And so we really think about kind of diversity as the presence of difference, inclusion as the practice of engaging and activating that difference. And then equity is the process of acknowledging that with that difference comes systems of disadvantage and advantage that are born way before people enter your workplace, and that it's your job to make sure that despite the inequities entering the workplace, that it's actually your job to make sure that you're still establishing an equal opportunity to resources, to success, and to advancement within your organization. So recognizing that with those differences comes different levels of power and privilege, and it's a process of how you navigate and mitigate those differences in systems.
Thank you. Those are great definitions. And I guess now that we're all on the same page, can you tell us, why does this matter? So why is it important for remote or distributed companies to have a DEI strategy and be aware of these things, aside from the obvious moral obligation? Like, how does diversity really make a company stronger?
Yeah, I'm giving it to you.
All right, I'll take it. I think it's important for any company, remote or not, to have a DEI strategy. I think now more than ever, it's just apparent that we are living in a society steeped in white supremacy and racism, and that doesn't stop when you enter a workplace. And so companies need to be thinking about this. If you just Google business case for diversity, tons of articles will come up and studies and data that, just talk about like why having a diverse company makes your company more successful, makes you more innovative, more, creative, even more profitable. So, there's plenty out there. It should be beyond business case at this point, right? Just, this is what we need to do. This is the work we need to do. Hard stop. Now let's think about how to do it.
Anything you want to add, Mariah?
I mean, yeah, she covered most of what I would have said, but I really think that at the core of why DEI matters, it's really because people matter. So if you're a leader, I shouldn't have to make the case to you that making sure that all of your employees feel a high sense of belonging and empowerment and inclusion is important, because your people working for you should matter. And beyond that, your customers matter. So if you're building a diverse team that represent a diverse set of identities and experiences and abilities, you're inherently setting yourself up to build a product that serves more people across those differences. And so at Webflow, the kind of why, one of the whys, we have so many whys, but one of the whys that it's really important for us to build a diverse team is that we need to build a team that represents the world we're trying to serve, which is everyone. And our mission isn't to empower everyone to build on the web and reduce the barrier of code to doing so. So we cannot fulfill our mission as a company unless we build and cultivate and advance and empower a team that represents and reflects the world we're trying to serve and build for.
Right. So it's definitely not just about, looking good on paper so you don't get in trouble. It's
exactly.
Like it's more than that. And it sounds like if you ignore diversity and the importance of all of these things, you're just really limiting yourself. And why would you want to do that?
Yeah.
So let's dive into how we can start building our own strategies or improve the strategies we already have. So I'd like to direct this one to Mariah. What is the foundation of a strong DEI strategy, and how does it relate to great leadership?
Yes. So I will say that the foundation of a great DEI strategy is not a big budget. It's not a head of DEI. And I'm sure a lot of people are like, what? I'm hiring for someone like that right now. They're important. But we're the only in the lonelies here when the one person doing the work. And we cannot drive actual and sustainable change because we're working against systems that have been deeply ingrained for centuries and beyond that. So the foundation really comes down to the leadership, the people who are in control, because what DEI is about is shifting systems of power, advantage, and disadvantage to make sure that you are reducing barriers to access, you're reducing barriers to advancement, and you're essentially allowing everyone on your team to succeed, and you're building a product that can help everyone succeed. And so the foundation is a leader's authentic commitment to diversity and inclusion, and it has to be personal. So just like you said, if the commitment is based on a fear of looking bad, or because they're getting, there's pressure currently, and there's kind of this current social imperative for this to be a priority, your strategy ends the minute that pressure disappears, and your strategy ends the minute that you no longer feel fearful of looking bad. And so in order for it to be enduring, and DEI is a long-term game and investment. It doesn't happen overnight. If you expect it to happen overnight, you're going to be gravely disappointed. But it is worth it. And in order for you, the DEI strategy that I would say is successful is one that's built on a long and enduring commitment by every single leader who's able to say that DEI matters to me personally because it is core to my ability to succeed as a leader. It's core to my ability for my team to build a product that's successful, and it's core to our organizational success. And if you can say those three things, when the rubber meets the road and it becomes difficult and uncomfortable and challenging and expensive, it will become all of those things at one point. You don't have to question, you don't have to bring yourself back to, is it worth it? Because you're at the core, you're committed to it. So, and then when I think about kind of the qualities of an inclusive leader, so the qualities of a leader who can build a successful strategy beyond just kind of being authentically committed to it and personally committed to it, there are three. There are a lot of inclusive leadership traits. There are three that I'll say today that I think also I would attribute to a leader who's successful at leading a remote team for the first time. Maybe you're leading a remote team now, or whether you've been always leading a remote team. And those things are curiosity, courage, and commitment. So curiosity is key because in order to change things, we have to figure out what we don't know and who we're not serving and who we're missing in our pipelines. And so an inclusive leader is curious. They're inherently curious about the needs of their team they're not meeting yet, the people that they haven't brought onto their team, the skill set they didn't even know they needed, and the perspectives they didn't know they needed, and the product that they don't even know exists yet, that they need different perspectives to come into. They're courageous. They're able to make sure that they can say, I'm wrong, and what worked before may no longer work, and I don't have all the answers, but I'm willing to ask the questions to get there. And it takes a lot of courage because you're going to engage in uncomfortable situations. You're going to say things that not everyone agrees with. That's another thing about DEI is if you're a leader who's authentically committed to it, you have to get over the people-pleasing element and focus on serving people, not pleasing them. So not everyone's going to be on board, and you kind of have to accept that that's okay and it'll be uncomfortable. And lastly is commitment. So if you're genuinely committed to the success of your team, you will be willing to do anything, including taking risks, including maybe not pleasing everyone, including speaking up when it's uncomfortable, to make sure that they feel a high sense of value, belonging, and empowerment and safety in the workplace. And those three qualities, which are curiosity, courage, and commitment, all allow a leader to be agile in a remote environment as well, because everyone is coming in with different needs. And especially in a global pandemic and health crisis and race crisis, there are all these things happening. And for the first time in a long time, we're dialing in from our living rooms. So the idea that we can bring a different self to work than we have at home is suddenly shot. That doesn't exist anymore. So now someone who's leading a remote team has to be able to say, I know you're a full-time parent now because your child is being homeschooled. And I realize that maybe my leadership and management style before is not going to work anymore. And I'm curious about how I can better serve you. So those same qualities that enable a leader to build a diverse team and empower that and advance that diverse team are the same qualities in a leader who can be agile enough to meet the changing needs of a remote workforce and the growing needs of a remote workforce.
Thank you. Leah, do you want to add anything to this?
No, that was excellent.
I know you said it very well.
Agree. Yeah.
Great. So once you have this solid foundation and you know the why behind what you're doing, and so when you plan to kick off your initiatives and specific actions that you'll take within the company, how do you hold your teams accountable for making progress? And more specifically, like, who is responsible? Of course, it's everyone's responsibility. But when you really want to get something done, usually there has to be specific people responsible for success. So how do you manage this? I know, Mariah, you talked about having a team of people within Webflow, and I'd love to hear from you, Leah. Why don't you start this one off? Yeah.
Sure. As Mariah mentioned, we don't have a specific person whose role is diversity, equity, and inclusion at Help Scout. From very early on, when we started our journey with this work, I was really clear, like, this should be everyone's job. If we hire someone and we make it their job, I really worry that then that diffuses responsibility and everyone's like, oh, okay, that person has it. So, I know a lot of people like Mariah are in those roles and they're doing amazing work and they're totally important and can have a lot of value. I just think they need to be really set up for success in the right way. And I'm sure Mariah can, speak to that a lot soon. But so historically, at Help Scout, a lot of the responsibility and accountability has been embedded in our People Ops team across all of our teammates. There's 5 of us on that team. And in conjunction with our executive leadership team, as Mariah said too, like, none of this really matters if the people with the most power at your company aren't on board and aren't supporting your initiatives and what you're trying to do. So that has worked really well for us. What I love that we've also expanded to do now is that all of our we call them our leadership team. All of our, the leaders at our company now are also responsible for, KPIs around diversity, retention, our inclusion scores. And so each individual leader knows those and then they're accountable to them. It's no longer, only People Ops who has to do something about it. And I just think it gives it even more teeth. It makes it even more meaningful.
So Mariah, do you want to jump in there and tell us about what you do at Webflow?
Yeah. Leah covered a lot of kind of what I wanted to say too, which is, even though I'm in this role, I came into this role and, my goal was in 2 years to not need someone in this role who has this title, because everyone carries the title unofficially at the company, which is a strange way to enter a role, to be like, I hope in 2 years you don't need me, but that would be great. Good sign for the company. I share a lot of the sentiments that Leah established. Was, People Ops is in charge of integrating a lot of this work into their existing processes and managing and making sure that they're measuring the metrics in those processes, whether it's hiring, whether it's promotions, whether it's even raises. We look at kind of how our raises are different between different demographic groups, because we at least need to have the metrics in place to hold ourselves accountable for shrinking those margins over time. I'll be really honest. I think this is one of the most important things you can do in DEI work, is to admit when you don't perfect something, and to admit that we haven't perfected this elusive kind of accountability, silver bullet with how do you make sure that people are held accountable. Because the reality is it's a process of kind of figuring out where people's intentions and commitment are going to be enough, and where you actually need to implement a lever that incentivizes the behavior you want to see. And that's really important, because behavioral change is really what's ultimately going to guide this organizational change. So we've established that in a few ways. We set a company-wide OKR, which is objective key result, that specifies that for every role that we hire for, in the final candidate stage, in the final interview stage, that there is a diverse representation of candidates. And that's relative to the current team, because we find that belonging on the immediate team is actually what affects someone's experience more than even belonging at the company. So it's really important that we're not just building a company that's relatively diverse, but we're building balanced teams where perspectives and identities are represented. And so what that does is it makes sure that we're not only focusing on getting a diverse candidate pool, but we're actually tracking what are the pass-through rates of different candidates. And we're holding our hiring managers and teams accountable for facilitating a structured process to ensure that at the end of the day, you have a 0% chance of hiring someone from underrepresented background if you don't interview them. That's full stop, and I can tell you, people are like, what's the best way to make sure I hire underrepresented groups? It's if you can ensure that they have a high representation in your final candidate pool. That's the truth of the matter. That is what people, it's a harder thing to do, but it works every time, pretty much. When you make sure you have a diverse representation at that final candidate set, you're ultimately setting yourself up for success for hiring someone. So that's how we make sure that we're holding our teams accountable, not just for attracting diverse candidates, but making sure that they're mitigating bias throughout the process and advancing those candidates at equal rates before they make an offer for the role. So we've made sure that bias is not impacting who we hire and what those decisions are, but really that we're focusing on kind of measuring those rates throughout the process.
So it sounds like there's, just hearing from both of you and reading about other companies, it sounds like there are really endless ways to do great work with your DEI strategies and initiatives. And this is also a really good reminder that you don't have to be Facebook or Google to really get great DEI work done. You can be a 10-person startup, and as long as you have that solid foundation of why you want to do this, you can just use your own team, use the resources you have, do this on a budget, and you can make it work. So it's a great reminder that there's no reason to think, oh, I can't do this at my company because we're not a massive corporation, we can't afford it. You can do it. You can figure out what works for your team. So many of us are here today because we want to learn more about your specific initiatives in different aspects of the work you do, from hiring to building a company culture that's inclusive. So both Webflow and Help Scout, you all have teammates distributed across the globe. So before we kick off, or as we kick off the topic of hiring, first I'd like to ask you, how has hiring remotely helped you build diverse teams? Maybe Leah can jump in on this one.
Yeah. So at Help Scout, we've been remote for almost 10 years now. And just from day one, our co-founders did not want to be limited by geography to hire amazing talent. And, it's been an awesome opportunity to hire almost anybody anywhere for this company. We're not limited to, certain local markets, or if a company is founded in a city that's not, really diverse, like those are going to impact how you hire. And I think now, we've all been sort of a remote companies now that we're in a global pandemic, but I think everyone's realizing, oh, right, there is a lot of our work we can move to make remote, and maybe also start hiring people in a remote way. So I'm excited to see what's going to happen for other companies too. But really, it just comes down to not being limited. You can hire great folks anywhere, and it absolutely impacts who you're able to hire.
Yeah, I will just jump on that and talk about kind of two groups specifically that I've noticed that we've been able to, in addition to everything Leah mentioned about kind of how you're able to recruit from different geographic regions. And that also impacts kind of if you're in San Francisco or in New York, a lot of what you'll note, in these kind of hot cities where tech was traditionally recruiting from, is that you're already limiting the diversity of your candidate pool just by the virtue of being there, because there's this level of socioeconomic status you have to be living there, or kind of generational wealth. There are barriers to entry to literally being in those places. But in addition to that, when you're hiring a team in a remote and distributed workforce, you also remove barriers to entry for people with disabilities. So people who, let's say that, they physically cannot come into an office for an interview, or they cannot, let's say, maybe they have a learning disorder that prevents them from being able to function properly in an open office space, which I have ADHD. So, open office spaces are like the bane of my existence. So I will say that there are, and working parents, for instance, too, if there's a mom or a dad or a primary caretaker at home who can't go into an office because they have caretaking responsibilities that require that they're at least home for most of the day, all of a sudden, when you're hiring a remote team, you have access to all of that talent and all of the amazing, abilities and skill sets that they bring to the table with them. So beyond even kind of just looking at the geography of who you're attracting with their building a remote workforce, the barriers that you take down for people with disabilities, for people who are primary caretakers, for people with learning or mental health disorders, all of those barriers are taken down. And now not only do those people feel like they can, apply to your company, but you're actually getting top talent that faces barriers elsewhere to join companies. So those are just to name a few specific, groups that we've seen an increase in representation from in hiring remotely. Those three we see increases in.
So I guess at the risk of oversimplifying this, there are really two huge things that hiring remote can do. One is flexibility for people who need flexibility, and for just everyone who wants it. Happy workers do great work. So people love to have the flexibility of working from home. It allows them to maximize their productivity and do things just the way that works for them. Some people do their best work sitting outside in their backyard. Some people like that office environment, but it's much quieter and more productive to work from home, unless you have kids. But that's another thing. It allows you to make time for your family and work a schedule that works for you in your life. And then the other side is obviously just removing geographical limits to who you're hiring. So I remember from our remote career summit, I always like to quote this from, what was her name? Michelle Powell from Under Armour. She said that hiring remote unlocks the door to diverse talent, but you still have to put in the work to really open that door and bring that talent in. So it's great. We know that remote work is awesome, removing those barriers, but we also know that physical location is not the only limitation to hiring a diverse team. So I know, Leah, you recently wrote a great article about unconscious bias and how it affects the hiring process. Can you tell us more about this? Explain what unconscious bias is and its impact on hiring?
Sure, absolutely. And this could be a whole other webinar, but we'll come back to that another time. So I'll try to keep this short, but bias is basically a particular, tendency or feeling or opinion you might have. And often there's not really any evidence or real obvious rationale for why you hold it. You just kind of do. And then unconscious bias is our underlying attitudes and stereotypes that we subconsciously attribute to other people. And it impacts how we interact with them. And so, spoiler alert, we all have bias and we all have unconscious bias. I think the first thing I always tell folks is you're never going to get to a place where you have reduced all bias. That's just not possible. We're all humans. But there's a lot of things you can do to mitigate it and just make sure it's not impacting how you're making decisions, especially when it comes to hiring. That's really where you see this creep in all sorts of ways, especially in tech. I think you hear a lot of examples of, folks who went to Stanford and think it's like the end all be all. And if someone applies to a role and they have Stanford on their resume, they get bumped to the front of the pile and, they get that interview and you might overlook that they're actually not a really good fit for the role, but you're just still thinking about this connection that you have because you both went to Stanford. And you give them that preferential treatment and maybe even hire them. And it turns out it was a poor fit. And then you have to go back to the drawing board and start over. And that's really expensive for teams and it takes a lot of time. So really, I think it's just important to be aware that we all have it. And then, there's a lot of ways that we can get into too to how to mitigate that.
Yeah. Mariah, do you want to jump in here too?
Yeah, I mean, I am like, I don't know what to add here. I will say that one thing that I think is important is to acknowledge that although we all have, and this is a message we try to send to our team, although we all have unconscious biases, and it's okay that we have them because they're not going anywhere. They're, an evolutionary trait that helps us make decisions with very limited information. If we're in a forest and we hear a strange noise, but we can't see anything, it's the thing that tells us, I think that noise is a lion, but I'm not 90% sure, but 90%, 80% sure is enough to run away or go hide. So they're good in a lot of ways. They help us function as humans. I think the most important thing to do though is to say that just because you have unconscious bias does not mean that it is acceptable for us to allow that bias to affect outcomes that affect hiring outcomes, for instance, that affect people's lives. And it's important for the organization to take responsibility for creating systems and processes for mitigating that bias. But it's also important for individuals to recognize that when you're moving quickly, when you are forced to make a decision with limited information, those are the times when your unconscious bias will actually start to express itself in terms of decisions you make. And so in those moments, acknowledging that you do have unconscious bias, but also saying, how might this be showing up? Check in with yourself. Say, why do I prefer this person over this person? How could my affinity bias, which is having a bias for people who are like you, they went to the same college, they like the same sports team, they belong to the same identity group as you. How can that bias be impacting the decision, and how might that also then impact my ability to make an effective hiring decision? I think that too is bias doesn't only impact our ability to make decisions objectively about people, it actually impacts our ability to make effective hiring decisions about who the best person for the job is, because we're including information that's irrelevant to someone's ability to actually succeed and contribute to the team. So that's something I'll say, is that I do think there are a lot of unconscious bias trainings that I think honestly just like make people feel better by saying like, we all have unconscious bias. But really it's like, what do you do with that information, is to say, not that it's okay, but actually that I need to take a responsibility to check in when I'm making a decision that can affect someone's life and can affect the success of our team, to say, let me make sure this bias that I know I have, doesn't impact the decision I'm making and isn't clouding my judgment from making an effective hiring decision in this case.
Yeah, I think I would just add to, some more specific, also concrete ways to actually do this. We want to make sure we're giving people really take home tangible things. If you are involved with hiring at your company, make sure you're doing interview training. Interviewing isn't a skill everyone is born with. That takes practice, it takes time, it takes intention. And you want to make sure everyone who's talking to candidates is on the same page about what you're looking for, how they're representing the company, what they're saying. So definitely, putting folks and hiring teams through interview training is critical. I think also in those moments, it's a great time to discuss unconscious bias. So what we do at Help Scout in our interview training that I give to our hiring teams is I have a little section where I talk about common unconscious bias pitfalls and go over ones that I've seen come up for us historically, and then just what to do about it. I think Mariah mentioned it too. a huge way to mitigate bias is just to acknowledge it, just to talk about it. So it's always really, top of mind for our hiring teams as we're going through the process, and that has shown to help reduce it. Another thing I think is so important is make sure you're doing structured interviews. So at each stage of your hiring process, you're asking the candidates the same questions, because you have to be able to compare apples to apples. It's the worst thing for me if a hiring manager thinks they can, go down one rabbit hole with a candidate and get off track and talk about other things, and then the next candidate they talk to, they ask completely different other questions. I always say, I'm like, okay, so how do we know who's a better fit for this role? I don't care who you had a better conversation with or who you liked more. That's all bias. That's not actually, useful data to say, is this person going to be successful at our company? Are they a good, addition to our team based on what we need them to do? So structured interviews just means you're writing down this, clear, concrete questions, hopefully behavioral in nature, which means just asking a lot of questions that give candidates a chance to demonstrate what they've actually done in their past, which gives you a chance to see, oh, they've done something like this before. They might be successful doing it here, instead of just throwing out kind of hypothetical questions that don't have a lot of, meaning. Like, sure, that's nice. You can ask some, but really, I think giving folks a chance to, talk about what they've actually accomplished before is great. And then lastly, since we use a hiring tool to help us do our hiring, it prevents everyone on a hiring team from seeing everyone else's feedback until they've entered their own. Because we all know humans are really impressionable. We're easily swayed by our peers. It happens. And so, sometimes if you see someone's interview feedback on a candidate and it's different than yours, you kind of panic, or you think, oh, if they liked them, I should like them. Or should I change my thoughts? So we really try to keep everyone sort of isolated with their thoughts after they've gone through an interview, give them a chance to write down their own ideas and their own feedback, and then we discuss it. Because it's really hard in a group to have a different opinion than someone else, especially if it's a group that you like in your workplace, and you don't want to, be the odd person out. But it's really important to, create that space where everyone can have their own independent thoughts, and then you go through and you have that conversation.
Thanks, Leah. I know I copied and pasted that article you wrote into the chat so people can check it out
Awesome.
to dive deeper into what you do at Help Scout. I know you mentioned a few of the things you do, and then also in the article you outline 7 specific aspects of your hiring strategy. Yes. That I think will be really helpful to everyone. Really useful, actionable, concrete things that you can look at to just learn from the example of someone who's a company that's figured out how to do it well, and yeah, make it work for yourself. And let's see, before we jump into talking about the results and the kind of the success of your strategies, I would love to hear more about Webflow's approach to this and how you mitigate hiring bias at your company.
Yeah, so the first thing I talked about was kind of just starting to measure, trying to figure out kind of where is bias showing up in our process. So someone actually asked how we measure the demographic data at different stages of our candidate pool. We use a tool called Greenhouse, and they actually have aggregated EEOC reports at each stage of the process that your team can look at to say how many, and it's, it is limited because it's not, you can't mandate that people give you that information, or applicants give you that information, but many applicants will provide that information. So you can look at each stage and say, okay, after the phone screen, what was the ethnic and racial breakdown of our candidate pool? After the team interview, what was the ethnic and racial breakdown of our candidate pool? And you can start to just validate where in the process is bias showing up. We realize that it's not after the phone screen. And another thing about DEI is it's really important to audit and figure out kind of where you can deliver the highest impact. So for me, I'm one person. So working with the hiring teams, I need to make sure that if I'm focusing on helping them reduce and mitigate bias at a certain stage of the hiring process, it is where bias is impacting decisions the most. And so I will work with, we found it kind of happening in our team interviews the most, individual interviews. And like Leah said, I realized that people were asking every candidate a different question, which is impossible to actually get information and kind of get objective evaluations of those candidates. So implementing structured interview training and making sure that we're focused on adding structure and also just naming what might prevent someone from running a structured interview, and asking people who told me it seems impersonal, and I'm worried that it's going to be awkward if I'm reading off of the list. So giving them tools as a little script at the beginning of their interview, which is saying if at any point this, it feels like I'm reading off of a list of questions. It's because I am. And it's actually because we want to facilitate a structured interview process to make sure it's as equitable as possible so that everyone has the same experience. And usually the response you get from a candidate isn't like, oh, awkward. It's usually like, oh, great, that's super cool. And then you reinforce kind of the DEI commitment, which is especially great for getting candidates from underrepresented backgrounds who have historically faced bias in the process to then feel more confident in the interview. So you're kind of killing two birds with one stone there, and both instilling confidence in those candidates who might have been afraid of interviewer bias, but also kind of mitigating that nervousness that comes with asking a set of questions that might seem impersonal in conversation. But again, reminding your interviewers, the goal is not to get to know the person. The goal is not to make a new friend. Like, we have a lot of avenues for that outside of work. But it's really to figure out, is this person going to be successful in this role? Do they have the competencies to set them up for success? And getting clear about what answers look like to interview questions. You would be very surprised at when I ask an interviewer on our team, like, what does a good answer look like? They can't even come up with what a good answer looks like. And so how are you supposed to evaluate the answers that you're given, get by candidates objectively if you don't set criteria up in terms of what you're actually looking for? And oftentimes you'll also find that when you ask that question, they'll realize that it was just a bad interview question. They'll realize it's actually not giving them any indicators as to whether or not a person will be successful in the role. And so it can be really helpful. And you don't actually need to be a hiring manager to do this. You don't need to be a head of DEI. You don't have to be a talent director. You can be someone who's involved in the process and just cares about this and goes and asks your teammates who are also on the panels, hey, do you have a list of questions that are, how are you going to structure your interviews? Do you want to practice this intro script about kind of how you're facilitating the process? Do you want feedback on how you're writing scorecards so we can see maybe how bias is present in the scorecards you're writing? And I think that's an action that no matter what steps your organization is taking or is willing to take, that you can take as an individual of the organization who wants to make sure that bias is mitigated, is really to hold everyone around you accountable for structuring their process as much as they can.
Yeah, that sounds like a really great first step. Of course, mitigating bias is not an easy job. We have this kind of invisible force that will help us survive in a forest, maybe.
Not me.
Or
Hopefully.
stop you from seeing a super cute animal that made that noise.
No.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But the hiring, it sounds like you definitely want to be more self-aware and really, like you said, ask yourself, why are you making the decisions you are, and really identify any spots where you might be influenced by things that really don't lead you to hiring the best candidate for the job. So I think for people, it seems like a complicated thing to start tackling, but that's a really easy, great start that anyone can do. Even a one-person company, like the startup, very, very startup phase, you can do that. You can have a standardized list of questions that you can ask. So that's a really great idea. Have you seen from these strategies, have you seen positive results so far? How do you measure your success? Do you have any numbers you can share?
Yeah. Well, for us, for measuring success for hiring looks a lot of ways. One of the things I care about the most is we use a candidate experience survey. So every single person who reaches at least to our second step of our process gets sent the survey. And our candidates are like our customers. We want them to leave feeling that they were treated with respect and integrity, and that even if they didn't get a job with Help Scout, they're going to go tell all their friends, hey, you should apply there. It was a really great experience. Like, I obsess over our candidate experience survey results. And so they get asked all sorts of questions about, do they feel they were fairly assessed? Were you treated with respect? And then we also ask, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend to someone to apply to a role at Help Scout? And of that, our average is 8.9. So I still feel very proud of that. I think that's great. We don't want to ever go below 8, honestly. But it's just constant feedback also to assess like how we're doing. How did we do on this hiring team? If we get a lot of positive feedback from candidates, I think that's a great way to know, like, okay, I think we're doing right, especially for folks who don't get a job with you and they're still giving you great feedback. To me, that's like the icing on the cake. That's like, okay, great. Whew. Also, we do a twice-a-year demographic and inclusion survey at Help Scout, and we use a tool called Culture Amp. But SurveyMonkey has a template that you can use, that you could even download and then just throw into a Google form and then do it for free. Like, there's a very low bar to doing a demographic and inclusion survey. and I highly recommend it. But it just gives you a chance to understand, okay, who is actually at our company? What are the different identities here? How are people actually feeling? Do people feel like they belong and have a voice and that things are fair? And without that data, to me, it feels like, well, how do you know if any of these initiatives are working if you're not asking these questions? But for us around hiring specifically, having that demographic data by team really helps us understand, okay, what do our teams look like? What identities and what demographics are missing? As we sort of, the goal for us is to achieve balanced teams. Really, that's to us a sign that like, okay, things are going in the right direction. A lot of people are like, well, what percent and like what number should things be for identities at your company? And I don't think there's like an answer to that because this work isn't ever done. And there's no like, I don't know. I would be curious to know Mariah's thoughts on that question if people ask that. But it's just, you have to survey to know who's here so then you can inform your hiring practices and figure out who you need to be recruiting and targeting. And then, I think also we measure 1 year churn. So if someone is at the company for less than 1 year to us, that means something kind of probably happened in the hiring process or in that journey to look for that person where it's like, oh, we must have not hired either for the role or maybe the role is off. And that, tracking that number for us also helps us kind of assess like how are our hiring initiatives going? And for us, our 1 year churn number for folks who choose to leave and then also involuntary is 7.5%, which we feel is pretty good for our size. And the goal for us is always to keep that under 10%. So we feel good about that.
That's great. So you've seen, wow, our time is really flying by here, I just noticed, but have you seen a change in your surveys after you started implementing these various ways of mitigating bias?
Yeah, I mean, our demographic data around race has just increased from when we started doing all this work in 2016. I've published a lot of reports on this, but actually what I'm really excited about, I think it's going live today, if not today, tomorrow. We've added to our footer of helpscout.com a DEI dashboard where if you go to it, it kind of lays out our whole DEI philosophy, and then you can sort through and look at all of our demographic and inclusion data since 2016, which I'm really excited about. And our design team is amazing and made it actually really fun to interact with and play with, but you don't see a lot of companies sharing this data publicly. And I think that's such a huge piece of this accountability is that we're not perfect. Help Scout's not perfect, but we're trying and we're sharing what we're doing so that we can all learn from each other and improve and then also hold ourselves accountable. Because there's a lot of areas where we're still not doing great and we're working on it. So having, this DEI dashboard be public is a great tool. And I think it gives candidates from underrepresented groups a chance to come and look and say, oh, okay, I won't be the only person from this identity here. Like that's a really good feeling to know when you're, considering working someplace.
Yeah, that's a great reminder that there's always room for improvement, even when you're already doing a great job, like it sounds like you are. Or if you're really reflecting, there might be some people in our audience right now that are thinking, oh my God, I'm missing a lot of things in the process that I'm doing, and or maybe even in my personal life, work, or whatever. The best thing you can do is just acknowledge that you can do better and
Exactly.
work on it. Always be working to do better, because just like in life, there's no real true perfection. You just keep working towards improvement, and that's the best thing you can do. So at Webflow, really quick before we move forward, how do you sounds like you do surveys too to measure the success of these, or you really see how the demographics change over time when you're working on different initiatives like this. So how have you seen positive results from the way you've been hiring people, and like how has it changed the way the numbers that are coming in really?
Yeah, there are a few things, and I'll move quickly because a lot of what Leah touched on with culture amp surveys in terms of like measuring the confidence level of people on our team that we're hiring diverse teams, that's been moving, that's been going up, which is important to us. We want to make sure people don't always, just because we're trying to do it, people think that, we're making a genuine effort and committed to it. So the pass-through rates of different demographic groups, since we've implemented the OKR for the company, those have increased in terms of just like the representation that you're seeing for underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. And a lot of that happens from sourcing. So focusing on making sure our sourcing teams are really focusing on like attracting and reaching out to underrepresented talent, and making sure that we are being really clear in our job descriptions about the, the necessary requirements, and then leaving out any nice to have requirements, because ultimately a lot of those can be learned on the job. We found a higher conversion in our job descriptions just when we ran them through inclusive language and inclusive text tools like Textio across the board. So when we get clear on what the requirements are for a job, and we don't say things like ambiguous things like demonstrated experience with, we get really clear about like, what does that mean? And taking out years of experience and focusing on what has the person been able to do in the past, let's say what you did have is 2 to 4 years on the job. Focus instead on kind of what did they accomplish in that time, because years of experience can be a barrier too in terms of kind of how you're building your pipeline. So we've seen an increased conversion across the board for all groups, which meant that just writing more inclusive job descriptions just meant writing better job descriptions that were attracting the right talent. But it also increased the number of women and underrepresented groups that we see apply to our roles as well. And everything that Leah said again about kind of we're looking at the demographics in tech and non-tech roles, and in our global employee base, and then our leadership too. So we want to make sure that we're not just filling our, individual contributor roles and junior roles with diverse talent, but we're actually making sure that is transcending throughout the ranks, because representation and leadership also really matters in terms of how people perceive their ability to succeed in the company.
Yeah, it sounds like every aspect of the hiring process is involved. You can really do something at every step in the hiring process, from writing your job description to interviewing to even afterward, when you look at retention. So our time is flying by like crazy. We have a whole other section we will not have time to finish. We might have to have a part 2 of this webinar, because we haven't even jumped into the super important aspect of inclusion and workplace culture. So definitely would love to follow up with you too on that aspect. But for now, we're going to have to jump into concluding our webinar for today and moving toward the Q&A section. But really quick, before we wrap up, I'd like to go through a couple rapid fire questions on the main takeaways of today's discussion. So first, if each of you could say in 1 or 2 sentences, what's the main takeaway you really want everyone here to remember when they walk away or turn their Zoom chat off?
I'd say start somewhere, and do your personal education as well, especially for white folks on the call. There's plenty of books and things to Google. Do that education for yourself. Don't put that on BIPOC folks to do it for you. Lean into that discomfort. This isn't easy and shouldn't be easy, but it's important. And the work is never done. Like, this is evolving. We're all on this journey. So just stick with it.
Yeah, I think my takeaway would really be that, when you're building your DEI strategy, especially if you're a leader, get really clear not only on the fact that you're committed to DEI, but get clear about what you're willing to do, what you're willing to give up, and what you're willing to invest in making it successful for the long term. So I think DEI strategies fail when they don't proactively acknowledge what it's going to take to be successful. So you're going to have to take risks. You're going to have to be uncomfortable. You might lose people who are not on board with your DEI efforts and the imperative of your company. You might have to sacrifice time to hire. You might have to slow down the hiring process to mitigate bias. So all of these things, get clear about your willingness and readiness to make those trade-offs and make those investments, because again, this is an investment strategy for the long run, because that will keep you going when it gets challenging, which it will. And that's the only way you can be successful, is if you make sure you have that personal commitment, not only to the fact that DEI is important, but also to the fact that it is more important than these other short-term risks that you might have to run or trade-offs you might have to make. And that means that when the rubber hits the road and it gets difficult and it gets uncomfortable, you're still in it, and you're going to see the rewards in the long run.
Yeah. And I mean, it does take effort, but the payoff at the end is far worth it. And the effects will be long-term in your company, with your innovation, the way people work together and their happiness and everything, just having the best diverse team, powerful and happy team that you can have. So what's next for us after leaving this webinar? Can you give us like 2 action items that everyone, whether they've started their initiatives or not, or let's say first time DEI strategy, what are like the first 2 steps that everyone should add to their lists right now?
I can go. Assemble a team. So again, you don't have to be a head of you don't have to have DI in your title. You want to, probably shouldn't, if you want to be successful in this. Assemble a team. Figure out who around you is and on your team is also passionate about this, and bring together a task force and call your leaders in and say, we're calling you in because this is important to us and this is going to enable us to succeed as an organization. And because we matter, the rest of our team matters, especially if you're white, for instance, saying the Black people on our team and our Black prospective employees matter. And we are calling you in to do this work with us, and assemble a task force. And the next thing I'll say is that you can't ultimately convince a leader to care about it. And so sometimes that's going to happen. But it's important to remember that you can make and influence change in your own circle. We all have especially if you have levers of privilege, you can demand that you have an equitable hiring process for your team. You can ask the company to do pay equity audits. You can make sure you're running meetings inclusively. You can, work to create anti-racist programs in your products, and you can try to write anti-racist code. So no matter who you are, you can start somewhere. And it's important to remember that even if you don't get that immediate leadership buy-in, that you can take steps to make sure that you're integrating it into how you operate. Because if you're not consciously acting and prioritizing inclusion, you're probably perpetuating systemic exclusion. So it's important to remember that individuals are responsible for doing that too.
So both on an individual level, commit yourself to demanding what's right in your company if you aren't the one in charge. And if you are the one in charge, assemble a task force, get that team ready with whatever resources you have. And that's a great way to start. And then Leah, what do you say? Okay, we have a DEI task force and we have no idea what to do next. What would you say to add to our to-do list?
Yeah, I think one of the first things I would suggest, like I said a little bit earlier, is run a demographic and inclusion survey. Equip yourself with that data to know what identities are at your company and what identities might not be at your company, and also how all those folks are feeling. And it'll help you inform goals and know what you need to do, know where you need to focus. You might learn that you have a lot of folks who feel like promotions aren't fair based on the survey. And then you can start drilling in on that. Or, my voice isn't being heard, and you filter it and you find that it's a majority women at the company who responded that way. Okay, well, we need to start taking that seriously and do something there. But it's hard sometimes, I think, to know what to sort of do if you don't have that data, if you don't have that knowledge. So again, these templates are free. There's no reason you can't use one of these and then just, run with the data and start doing something.
That's great. Thank you. I hope everyone feels like you're ready. If you didn't know what you were doing before, I hope you feel ready to get started. And also, for those of you who already have a DEI strategy and initiatives in place, you can definitely look to what Webflow and Help Scout are doing and see what they're doing that they've proven works, and just give it a try at your own company. And I also have a couple, as we wrap up toward Q&A, I want to share with you a few recommendations of resources that you can check out that Leah and Mariah have compiled in a Google Doc for you. So I'm going to drop that doc in the chat. Make sure to save it before the Zoom meeting is over. And you can just go through, there's a lot of great learning resources, things that will help you out as you move forward with your own initiatives. So, all right, let's open this up to Q&A. See, the chat's kind of wild over here. Go back to the top. Thank you so much, everyone, for adding your questions in here. All right, we have one question for Help Scout about being an international organization. How do you tackle challenges around gathering diversity data from different regions governed by different legislations, e.g. EEO1 in the US, GDPR in the EU, etc.?
Yes, all the wonderful privacy things that are great. Again, so we use Lever for our hiring ATS, and there is a function to gather that data. It's optional, so candidates don't have to do it. And then internally, our demographic and inclusion surveys are also optional, but everyone is pretty excited about this work and knows that it's important to this company. So folks volunteer and give that information. And it's anonymous. So, it's not tied to someone's name. so we don't actually know, who's responding and saying what. So I don't know if that's exactly what they were looking for there, but
I'm just
happy
giving them
to,
option to disclose it.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, sounds good. And then we have someone asking, are self-reflection / self-awareness questions good to ask? Like, what is your management style, or what do you look for in someone who will be managing you? I guess that sounds like some of the questions you might include in your surveys, just to see the general level of happiness of your employees and people who go through the hiring process.
Yep.
I think you went over that a little. Do you have any suggestions for alternative tools to Textio? Or
I linked a free tool. Yeah, I linked a free tool actually in there. It's Gender Decoder. It's much less glam than Textio, but if you don't have a budget for Textio, it will do the job. And you can also just kind of send it to your hiring managers to make sure they're using it. And it builds a little bit of learning into it too.
Awesome. Yeah, everyone out there should maybe open a little Google Doc and drop in all these great links so you can keep track of them once the meeting is over. Let's see.
Mariah and I were sneaking into the chat and answering things on the fly.
I see. All right. Anything new coming in? Interview questions versus behavioral. I feel like you covered most of the answers to the questions so far. If anyone else has other questions, pop them in there quickly because we're about to wrap up. But then also feel free to email us any follow-up questions you have. We might be able to get answers out of these awesome people. We'll see. Anyways, I guess we will move forward to concluding our day for today.
That's
that
me.
was Leah. All right. So it looks like we're out of time. Thank you so much for sharing such helpful advice with us. And thank you to our attendees for joining. And I really hope everyone feels like you learned something new that will help you move forward with your diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives or improve the ones that you're already working on. To stay tuned for future events, you can follow us on Twitter at Arc.dev. That's at ARCDOTDEV. And we'll also email you the recording of today's event as soon as it's ready. And one last thing before we head off, I just wanted to give you all the heads up that our next webinar is coming out really soon on October 6th, where we'll be chatting a different topic, but we'll be chatting with remote management expert Sasha Connor, who pioneered remote work at the Clorox company. And we'll discuss how you can battle remote employee burnout with effective communication practices, which I know is an issue that a lot of people are facing, especially in this stressful year that we're living. So I will also toss the link to that in the chat right now so that everyone can save it if you're interested. And I'll hang out after we conclude. I'll hang out for an extra minute, leave the Zoom call open so you can grab these links before you head off. And that looks like everything for today. So thank you to everyone. Thank you so much to our speakers, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.